Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The NARM therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marcia Black. If you are working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. And now for our interview. David R. Dow is the founder of the Texas Innocence Network and the director of TIN's Death Penalty Clinic at the University of Houston Law. In 2014, he and his wife, Katya Dow, established the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project, which provides legal and social services to at-risk, disadvantaged, traumatized, and marginalized youth. In addition to being a lawyer, Katya is receiving her Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology from NYU. Please enjoy this conversation with Katya and David R. Dow. All right, I'm sitting here with David and Katya Dow. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. And we were talking before we pressed record, and I'm excited that we have both of you here because you both bring something really unique and special to the table when we're talking about trauma and complex trauma. So I wondered if the two of you could each kind of tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you came to this work.
You want to start, Katya?
Okay, sure. So I've been the program director, the legal program director for the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project that David and I founded about 10 years ago, which was based at the University of Houston Law Center. And in that position, I was training law students how to work in the foster care system and the juvenile justice system in Texas, representing youth. And doing that work over the last 10 years, I became very cognizant of some real gaps in understanding in these systems about how trauma is affecting these kids and how behaviors that stem from trauma are misinterpreted and treated as delinquency or misbehavior or oppositionalism, and also that they are not, or they haven't traditionally been effectively treated in these systems for these kids. As I was doing the work, I started to see that decisions were being made on behalf of the lawyers that were representing these kids, on behalf of many of the judges, where mental health decisions were being made when nobody really understood what was happening with these kids and how trauma played a part. And so I decided that I wanted to really understand more. And I, 2.5 years ago, decided I would just, the best way to do this was to enter a master's program, which I did at NYU. And I have been studying mental health and wellness and getting a master's degree in counseling so that I better understand these issues. And so that's how I came to do this work.
And you were practicing as a lawyer prior to your educating these law students?
Yes. So prior to that, I was working as a lawyer for 20 or 15 years, pretty much in basic business litigation. But I was working as a volunteer with a program called Child Advocates. And that's how I first became aware of some of these issues and became interested in doing the work sort of in a more focused way.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. And David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
My story is a little bit different. I've been teaching at the University of Houston Law Center for 30 years. And about probably 5 years into my teaching career, I became involved in the death penalty system, really quite by accident. I wasn't really interested in the death penalty per se. I was interested in a procedural subpart of the system. But accidents happen. And so I started to represent a guy in the mid 1990s, and then one led to two led to four led to eight. And you wake up 30 years or 25 years later anyway, and you're a death penalty lawyer. And so my contact with the consequences of trauma was a type of contact where I didn't really even know the vocabulary, because I didn't really know anything about trauma. Almost everything I know about trauma I've learned from Katya, but I saw the effects of it, and the effects of what I later learned was trauma manifested itself in my clients in basically the same way in 90, 95, 99% of the cases. And so it was, gosh, I don't know what, like 20 years into my career as a death penalty lawyer that Katya and I were talking about repeatedly. We had many conversations. It wasn't a single conversation. So we would just have many conversations about how my clients were the people who she had had contact with when she was a volunteer for Child Advocates, who nobody had been looking out for. And so they didn't have Katya Dow as their child advocate, and they didn't have anybody else who cared about them, and they end up being executed. And I would say, and your listeners might be interested, Emily, in the years that I've been doing this, I've represented 110, 115, maybe 120 guys, and I can really count on one hand the number of them who I think came into the world broken. All of the other ones ended up on death row, not because they came into the world with a gun in their hand, so to speak, but because of trauma that happened to them. And so Katya and I would have these conversations. And so 10 years ago, both of us, without knowing anything about or Katya knew something because she had been a child advocate. I knew nothing about the juvenile justice system, decided to create a program for kids. And Katya became an expert in the legal programs. And so that led her to the journey that she just described to you, where she learned that the legal system was not only poorly equipped to deal with the trauma that these people in the system were having, but oftentimes unaware that it even needed to deal with it. And so in terms of the juvenile system, I've really been somebody who just helped Katya raise money and otherwise stood on the sidelines and watched what she was doing. But I think that experience has reaffirmed something that I have believed for a long time, and it was really the premise of the TED Talk that I gave about the death penalty, which is that almost all of the people who end up on death row could have been, if society were interested, could have been healed, if I can use that word, before they became murderers. So that's how I ended up here.
Wow. Well, let's dig into this because there is so much here, I know. And David, you keep saying Katya is the one that knows about trauma, but I mean, you really highlighted too, you were witnessing the effects of it. So I love that you both bring, your own perspective and kind of your own, like from where you stand, this is how you're seeing it. From where you stand, this is how you see it. So the first question I always like to ask really is, what would you like our listeners to take away from this conversation that we have today?
I would like them I work in a very narrow segment of the criminal justice system. And the narrow segment that I work in is the death penalty system. And I think many people have this image of the people on death row that was the same image I had before I started working on these cases, which is that these people are homicidal monsters. It's an image, I think, that is really fostered by a handful of infamous cases. I'm thinking, for example, of Charles Manson and his killers in California, and it's fostered by the media. So I'm thinking of a case like Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. And I think people have that image, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think the reason I think that is because it's the image that I had before I started representing these guys. And in fact, that image is completely wrong. The people who end up on death row are basically people who are just like me, except for a very, very small difference in what their experience was when they were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. And so the one thing that I would like them to take away is that almost everybody on death row is there because of something that person did, but that the reason that person did it in almost all of the cases is because that person was suffering in a way that society could have addressed much, much sooner, but didn't.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think bouncing off of that, what I would like people listening to this to understand is, or to believe, is that especially when people are young, change is not only possible, it is likely if you use the right tools and the right approaches to get there. And I mean, we've made great strides in Texas, especially in our juvenile justice systems, at least in Harris County. But there's still kind of an approach, and this is particularly true still in our foster care system, where there's not enough attention paid to what has been done to these children and how much help they need, how much support they need, how much they need therapeutically. And if they get that appropriately, change is immensely possible. And what is happening now with kids basically leaving the foster care system, if they're not already, in the juvenile justice system, they very often end up in the criminal justice system, or they end up homeless. They end up, struggling quite a bit simply from having been in the system. If they were treated appropriately while they were in the system, that would be unnecessary. That would not be happening the way it is and in the numbers that it is happening in right now.
Gosh, what I'm hearing in that really is a lot of these kids get in the system because they've experienced trauma, and then the system further traumatizes them. It just perpetuates.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm wondering if you can expand on this a little bit more when you're talking about how you're seeing this as like these kids get into this system, they're further traumatized. How did you really witness that? Because you have, all the work that you did previously as an attorney and then as a child advocate. Can you talk about kind of that, what you saw through your journey of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think probably I could just tell a story which is illustrative of a case where I thought it was very clear that something was missing in how we were addressing a child's needs. And I, at the time when I was representing this young man, also didn't understand trauma and behavior-based trauma as well as I do now. This was maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and I represented a young man who I absolutely adored. He was so bright, and he had been coming in and out of foster care because basically, from a very young age, he had been on the streets or he'd been living with his mother, who was a prostitute. And he had witnessed some pretty horrific things, including, his mother being beat up to within an inch of her life when he was very young and felt powerless to protect her. But when I started representing him, he was, I think, 16 years old and had come in simply because he voluntarily turned himself into the foster care system, but he was also in the juvenile justice system for a minor offense. It wasn't anything too worrisome. And as I represented him for that year, I just was so impressed with his ability to set goals for himself. He during that time got his GED in 1 year. I mean, he had the sort of ability to focus, set a goal, and meet that goal, which I've seen rarely in kids, especially in the system. But he was having, in the placement where he was having these, what I can only describe as kind of outbursts of violent behavior towards individuals that it didn't even make sense that he would react to. There were people who didn't seem threatening. They were weaker than him. It was unclear what he felt, like triggered by. And even then, I didn't even know the term triggered at that time. I just kept saying to him, "You're ruining everything because, you've done such great stuff here, but then you'll like have this like, violent outburst against a kid and it doesn't even make sense." And he couldn't explain it either. He didn't know, he just knew that something about this kid was setting him off and he couldn't control himself. And at the time was receiving no real therapeutic attention either. I mean, they had a great jobs training program there, and there were some teachers that he really connected with, but there was nobody addressing like the past trauma that he had gone through. He would talk to, me as his attorney, but that was really the only person he felt comfortable and safe discussing things in his past with. And then he eventually he acted out again, and a teacher tried to control him, to stop him from reacting to this other kid in a violent way. And he ended up kind of, headbutting the teacher and immediately was sent to jail. And I, at the time, could not understand, what was going on. And I feel like since that time, there have been steps taken to really start to understand and therapeutically address trauma in kids. But it was a real eye opener for me because I felt helpless. And I think, many of the people working with him, as much as they liked him and wanted to see him succeed, felt helpless because they just didn't understand why he was acting the way that he was acting. He didn't even quite understand it,
Yeah.
obviously.
Sounds like it was really confusing for everybody involved, including him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'd like to contrast that, though, to a young woman that I worked with who she comes from a background of not as much. I mean, she had a father who was also mostly negligent and a mother who ended up really deteriorating because of drug use. And she started having behaviors that involved self-harm. And so she was not outwardly aggressive in any way, but she was, she had suicidal ideation for a while. She ended up, in hospitals a couple of times, but she also had like almost, constant self-harming issues. And for quite a while, there was no place to put her. I mean, there were no placements in Texas that understood or wanted to take a child with this type of behavior because it was too much work. And so, many of these group homes, they're independent entities from the foster care, the state, I should say. And so they were always worried about losing their license. And so all they cared about really, their bottom line was, we don't want to have to worry about this, constantly supervising this young woman. I mean, and so it was really frustrating because it felt like she was being rejected from like placements where she could, finally make some progress and feel safe. However, she was placed in a really lovely, one of the newer residential treatment centers that is very therapeutically based. And I have been incredibly impressed with, because of the fact that she receives appropriate trauma-based therapy, and because everyone in that placement understands where this behavior comes from and how to approach it, she has made incredible strides and is now thriving. And this despite other really, major upheavals in her life recently, is doing so well. And it makes you see what the appropriate interventions can do for these kids and how it can change the long-term outcomes for the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for kind of sharing those two, describing both of those examples, because it sounds like they had some things in common in the beginning. And obviously they both had experienced trauma, but just depending on the kind of care that they received in trauma-informed therapies, what a difference those outcomes were. That's so valuable to hear because that gives us hope. It also
Yes.
helps us see, okay, there's a huge difference. And it's not just about the kid. It's really about the resources and the therapies that they receive that can make such a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Katya. David, I wondered if you would share, because we'll direct listeners to your TED Talk, because I know that there's a whole thing there. But I wondered if you could share too, kind of how you came to this.
Yes. So I said a few moments ago that I had this image in my head of who the people were on death row that was belied by the people who actually are on death row. And I think maybe the first time I got to know one of my clients reasonably well and became aware that he was smart and funny and loving and talented, I thought, oh, this guy's an aberration. And then I had another client and he was smart and funny, talented and loving. I thought, oh, wow, look at that, two aberrations. Then it's 10 and then it's 20 and then it's 30. And then you eventually realize that almost everybody. And the guys who end up on death row do remarkable things once they are on death row that simply shows how talented and accomplished they are. Some of them draw, some of them make crafts out of things that they buy from the commissary, like popsicle sticks. Some of them write poems, some of them write novels, some of them write graphic novels, some of them write memoirs. And I would witness my clients having conversations with their parents or their kids or their spouses or partners. And these people, just I think very similar to the people that Katya was describing just a moment ago are these people who have skills and talents and human qualities that are not seen because they're overwhelmed by other characteristics. So in the cases that Katya was talking about, one characteristic might be a young kid who's lashing out at others around him, or it might be a young woman who's in fact harming herself. And the same thing is true with my clients. They have these qualities that were not seen because of other things that they did. Maybe it's selling drugs, maybe it's armed robberies, maybe it's violent behaviors, and then ultimately it's homicide, because that's how they become my clients. They ultimately kill somebody. And I think what I would say to answer your question, Emily, is that I didn't, when I first began to notice this about all of my clients, I didn't have the vocabulary to even say what it was. And it's now clear to me with the experience that I've had that it's exactly the same sort of trauma that Katya is talking about, except that my clients never got the therapeutic treatments that the second person who she described is getting. Instead, they were shipped off to the juvenile justice system, or sometimes maybe even certified as adults and sent off, to adult prison when they're 16 years old. I mean, the only thing that happens when you send a 16, 17-year-old kid to prison is that the kid becomes worse than he was when he arrived. So I understand when family members of murder victims want the person who murdered their loved ones, to be punished. And I understand when families of murder victims think that people like me, lawyers who represent death row inmates, care more about the murderer than we do about the murder victim. And I would just like to say that the universe of death penalty lawyers is a pretty small universe. I probably know 98% of the people in that universe, and it's not true for anybody I know, and it's not true for me. I have enormous sympathy and empathy for that matter, because I've known people who are murder victims for that point of view. But all that I would say is that I now understand how my clients got into the position that somebody wants them to be severely punished. And I didn't have that awareness before. And I had the awareness before, I should say that I had the awareness before I had the vocabulary. I didn't know how to talk about it until probably the last 3 or 4 years. You can see the phenomenon before you can explain it in words and before you become aware of the literature that gives you the vocabulary to talk about it. But despite the fact that I didn't have the vocabulary 25 years ago, I was already seeing the consequences 25 years ago.
Gosh, as both of you are talking, my heart just feels, I'm just feeling really tender for, all the folks that you've been working with. And I don't know, there's a few things that are coming up to me. It makes sense why the families would sort of want justice, why they would want maybe a punishment. We've had a few guests on the podcast, in the restorative justice space, and hearing them talk about the same thing, it's all connected of like, human life is human life. So just because we want to advocate for folks who have experienced trauma and found themselves in these situations where they reacted in a way that put them in that position, that doesn't mean that, we think that their life is more valuable than someone who's been victimized. Right. But I'm just really feeling into the importance of what it means as a society for us to recognize that when we address the trauma, we're looking at the root cause. And if we can go upstream and find what's really happening and address that, we can prevent so many of these situations from happening. And it's not about, catering to someone who doesn't, quote, deserve it, but it's about let's as a society come together and look at the trauma and support folks that are in the middle of that so that we can totally avoid some of these other things that happen. That's what's coming up for me right now. And I'm just feeling in NARM, we have a word called heartfulness, which, like we have mindfulness and there's heartfulness. And that's what I'm really feeling into is our listeners can't see your faces, but I'm seeing both of your faces and this radiance, this kindness, this love that both of you have for your clients. It's so evident. And I'm just really feeling into your heartfulness. So thank you for the work that you're doing and for being willing to come here and share your time with us, because I think it's so important for our listeners to hear about the work that you're doing so that in our own spheres, we can support this kind of work and happening. So I just had to say that was coming up for me the time both of you were talking.
Can I just say one quick
Please,
thing, Emily, because
please.
your comment made me want to say this, and that is that I understand that the family members of the murder victims have trauma too.
Yeah.
So my clients have a trauma, and I'm very cognizant of how that trauma affected their behavior. But I also understand that the surviving family members of the people my client killed and the loved ones of the person my client killed, they have their own trauma. I just think it's very important to recognize that, and as we know, the way people react when they're triggered by a trauma, it's not something that you can rationally untangle.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a rational process. And so I just think that it's important to be aware of that, both as somebody who's inside the system, as somebody who's inside the legal system, but also for people who are standing outside it. When you see people standing across the street from one another screaming at each other, both of them are acting because of trauma.
Mm.
And they're not even trying to persuade each other. They're just exhibiting their trauma.
Thank you for sharing that. And I hesitate to even, because I'm not an expert in this space. So I hesitate to even say how I'm feeling about it because I recognize what you're saying. Like even the families have experienced trauma. And so I don't want to downplay anyone's experience. It's all important. And what you're saying is really important for all of us to hear. So thank you. Again, I really appreciate that. So I wonder in our remaining time here, I wondered if you could share, I guess you've kind of both shared a little bit about how you came to this work, but if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about what personally drew you to this work, and then maybe any other stories that could illustrate, the path that you've been walking.
I think for me, I started to do the work as a volunteer guardian ad litem at about the same time maybe a year after I had given birth to our son, Lincoln.
Mm.
And I couldn't help but sort of contrast how my son was growing up and being cared for and the love and attention that he received every day of his life versus some of the kids I was representing as a guardian ad litem and how they weren't, receiving what he was receiving. And every day it was like a calculus for me, like, wow, like what is the difference here every day between what my son is getting versus what these kids are getting, or what my son is experiencing versus what these kids are experiencing. And it just was patently obvious to me that it was unfair.
Yeah.
It's not fair that some kids get what every child should have and other kids don't. And then if that's not recognized and if it's not treated appropriately with an understanding that they're just doing the best that they can given what they haven't received, that detrimental long-term consequences for that child, which to me just seemed completely untenable. Like I just couldn't
Yeah.
accept that.
Yeah. What comes up for me as you're saying that is how that perpetuates generationally. So kids don't get what
Yes.
they need, and then they have children, and those kids aren't going to get what they need because their parents don't have, and how generationally that's passed down. Yeah.
Yes.
And so one thing that Katya just said that I thought of because of what she was saying is that part of the reason that happens, it's not the only reason, but part of the reason that happens, and maybe even the biggest part of the reason that happens. And when I say that, what I mean is ignore the problem, and then it happens in the next generation, and ignore it again, and then it happens in the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically because we as a society, and there are other societies like this too, but the United States is a particularly egregious example of it. We as a society, when it comes to the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system, can't do math. And so we don't want to spend $20, $30, $40, $50,000 today, which is what it might take
Mm-hmm.
in order to provide the treatment and the therapy that somebody requires, because we don't want to spend $20, $30, $40, $50,000 times the number of kids who need it. And we just don't take into consideration that the cost of not doing that
Mm-hmm.
is not going to manifest itself until 10 years down the road. And when it does, the cost of not doing it is going to be an enormous multiple what it would have cost to address the problem, in the first place. And So I don't really know how to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Because that's fundamentally a political problem. That's not a Katya was talking earlier about how there's so many people in the juvenile justice system who don't understand trauma and these kids who are not getting the right kind of treatment. And all of that's true. But there are some people who do understand it. And the problem that they confront is that they understand it, but they can't persuade the people who control the purse strings to fix it. So I don't know what the solution is. Maybe somebody who listens to your podcast has a solution.
Well, I love what you're highlighting. And that's one of the missions of this podcast is to highlight all the folks who are working in various spaces. So there's people working in public policy and folks doing like what you're doing, you know, representing clients who have experienced trauma, and Katya, all the things that you've done. Like, I just think that that's the beauty is like we all have our own sphere and we can show up and contribute in some way. That's what I think I'm hoping for to hear, you know, on this podcast, folks just in all the different spaces. And you're naming the policy piece, like, gosh, and then who has the purse string? So who's working with that?
Yes.
We'll reach them, hopefully bring them here at some point and have someone sharing how they're controlling the purse strings in a way to help transform trauma. But yeah, you're naming something really important there.
Yeah. And then to answer the question you asked a second ago, I would say that I got into this work as somebody who really just cared about the legal principles that were at stake. And what I mean by that is that if you're rich and white, you're not going to be my client. If you're poor and white, you might be. But if you're rich and white, you're never going to be. If you're middle class and black, you might be. If you're poor and white, you might be. And so there's just this inequality that is what drew me to the work in the first place. I often wondered, did I get interested in law because I already had this idea of equal treatment, or did I become interested in equal treatment because I went to law school? I don't really know. It doesn't really matter. Either way, I'm at the same place. I'm a lawyer and I care about equality. And that was how I came to the work. And then once I arrived at the work, for that reason having to do with legal principle, was when I think I began to have my eyes opened to this broader social phenomenon that resulted in, or played a big role, even if it wasn't the only factor, in how the people who are my clients came to be my clients. So at some point, one of the other lawyers on the team of death penalty lawyers that I manage and I had this idea that we wanted to try to figure out how many people on death row had had contact with the juvenile justice system. And juvenile justice records, even when somebody's already on death row, are still sealed. But what we did was we came up with a workaround, which was that we got releases from people on death row that directed their lawyers to share with us whatever records they had about their contact with the juvenile justice system. And so we ended up with, I don't remember precisely how many, but I think at that time there were something like 310 or 20 guys on death row in Texas. And I think we ended up getting releases from around 90 or 95 of them. It was close to a third. And then of those, about 70 of the 90, their lawyers actually had that information. So if you just do back of the envelope math, we ended up with the data on about 1 out of 4 guys on death row. And in that 1 out of 4, 90% had had a contact with the juvenile justice system. I mean, that's, to me, that was staggering. I was expecting half. And you see, it's 90%. It's like unbelievable. I mean, that is so many opportunities that the system had that it failed to take advantage of. And I don't have any reason to think that it's a different percentage from all of the people whose records we were unable to get.
Right.
Either because they didn't sign a release or because the lawyers didn't have the record, or, whatever. So you go from just being a lawyer to being somebody who puts the death penalty problem in a much broader and larger context. And just in a way that you were talking a moment ago, Emily, your metaphor was, let's catch the problem upstream. It's not only that we should catch it upstream, it's that in the case of all of these guys on death row, we had a chance to catch it upstream. And they were in the system that Katya was describing at the beginning of the show, where she was saying, the system is not attentive to this, and that is just borne out in the data that we collected.
My mind kind of goes to this place where I start thinking, okay, the two of you have this knowledge, and together you bring to the table really a more holistic way of seeing the problem. I wonder, have you thought about, okay, if you were to change it, if you could wave your magic wand, what would you change if you could go upstream? What could possibly, and this is a big question, I know, maybe it's not fair because there's probably bazillions of things that you would change, but maybe what are some things that you could entertain the idea of, this is a potential, this could maybe actually happen if we had the right support?
Emily, I'll just tell you the metaphor we use all the time. And the metaphor that we use all the time is we just got to blow the whole thing up.
Okay. Demolish it. Take it down to the studs, the foundation.
That's what you have to do.
Yeah.
I mean, because part of the problem is that there's a lot of component parts. And the other part of the problem is that all of those component parts, they think all of the other component parts are responsible for the problem.
Okay.
It's not my fault.
Yeah. Okay.
They're also all fighting for the same resources. So Katya can talk about the structure that she would want to build. My specialty is just dynamiting the existing structure so that she can build whatever she wants to.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I agree with the dynamite approach too. And, I'm also talking about two different systems, whereas I think David, works primarily in the criminal justice system. I mean, for me, I think there should be different approaches for the foster care system and the juvenile justice system. But I do think one thing that I would say would be an overarching change for both systems is to put more resources into supporting families and like keeping children in their communities, in their family systems, and just bolstering whatever is already there, if that's at all possible, rather than trying to pull the kids out and putting them into, state care or into a detention center. There's research that shows that this is, a valid and doable approach. And we just haven't tried that enough, I think, here. And to really put money behind that, I mean, and that would require really rethinking everything in terms of, okay, what are we going to criminalize? What are we going to do when, there is something that arises where there needs to be intervention by the state?
I endorse that, by the way. I don't want to make it sound like there's nothing that can be done unless you blow up everything. I think Katya is absolutely right that if you go as far upstream as you possibly can, that's what you should try to fix first. That if you then jump down to the very end of the river, which is where I am, that we as a society should be cognizant of the fact that the reason those kids are there is because we as a society didn't do what we could have done farther upstream. And rather than just saying all of these people are bad people, we're going to execute them, I think we should have a little more grace and a little more humility and say that these people did a really bad thing, but we as a society are not blameless. That doesn't mean we should excuse what they did. It doesn't mean we should hand them the key to the jail so they can walk out. It means that we should really have a lot of pause about whether we're going to execute people for something that they did that was horrible, that almost certainly could have been prevented if society had been doing the sort of things that Katya was talking about just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, what I'm hearing in that, what's kind of coming up for me is this idea of just remembering the humanity, just remembering. And I've often thought when I hear stories of folks that kind of land in the position that you're talking about, David, is I think, or I'll kind of read through and I see what they've been through, maybe just the tip of the iceberg of what they've experienced in their life. And I often think, gosh, if I experienced a tenth of that, I could see myself going down that road. I could see myself in their shoes.
I had a kid who had so much trauma and abuse as a child in elementary school in a small town in Texas that the solution that the school came up with was to basically build a little jail cell in the classroom. They basically took a playpen and they put foam walls on the side of it and they put a roof on it and they kept the kid in there. And This is a kid who in fourth, fifth grade is acting out so violently, and we're leaving it to the elementary school teachers in a small Texas town to try to prevent him from hurting his classmates. And they accomplished that goal at a huge cost. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about how when you get to the end of this chain of events, we really as a society need to rewind the tape a little bit and examine all of the things that we as a society did that were not the right decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, the two of you really have a breadth of knowledge, but a real depth. I really get this sense from both of you that your hearts are so open and you've taken in and you've seen so much that a lot of us could really, learn from. And I appreciate you taking the time to share all of that with us. I wonder if you could share kind of some final words, like what would you want, our listeners to know kind of as we're looking toward the future? What can we do in our situation that might support some of these efforts that you're naming?
Well, I would probably say that, having gone through this master's program and learning about therapeutic approaches to treat trauma, that people should understand that building resilience, especially in young people, can make a huge difference in long-term outcomes. And the right therapeutic approaches can actually completely change the trajectory of someone's life from a negative path to a positive path. And that's where we should be focusing, that we should understand and believe that these kinds of changes are possible and that we should be putting all our efforts towards promoting those.
Thank you, Katya, for highlighting that. And David, how about you?
I would just add to that of my work ordinarily involves representing death row inmates who are close to execution. Part of it also is at the beginning of the death penalty process where prosecutors are making a decision whether to seek death in a particular case. And the way we have had success in some of the smaller counties in Texas is by explaining to the prosecutors who are making the decision how much it's going to cost to pursue a death sentence versus how much it's going to cost to pursue another sentence that will keep society every bit as safe. And so I think the point that I would emphasize, which is really just piggybacking on what Katya said, is I don't think that this whole topic that we've been talking about is a topic where the line that separates people on one side of the debate from people on the other side of the debate is whether you have empathy or sympathy or whether you're kind-hearted or whether you're forgiving or whether you're non-judgmental or any of that. I think Katya would attest that I'm one of the most judgmental people she knows, and I'm sometimes not all that forgiving. I think that therefore what I would want people to keep in mind is that strictly from the point of view of economics, what we've been talking about for the last hour makes sense. You just used the metaphor a moment ago, Emily, pennies upstream for dollars downstream. And that's exactly right. And my experience in talking to district attorneys is that you can spend a little bit of money to keep society safe, or you can spend a ton of money to keep society safe. Which would you rather do? Mm-hmm. You'd rather spend less if you get the same result. And so I just think that it's a matter of being able to have a conversation with not only the public that cares about this issue, but the decision makers who decide what they're going to spend money on, and be able to explain cogently but succinctly that what we're talking about is cheaper than the alternative. So even if you don't think that it's the right thing to do, that's fine. Let's just talk about what's the economically wise thing to do. I don't really care why people get to the right answer as long as they get to the right answer.
Yeah. Thank you again. We so appreciate both of you and you taking your time and being so generous to share with us your experiences.
Thank you.
It was our pleasure, Emily, and thank you very much for having us both.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you learn and integrate NARM, you will receive individualized support and join an engaged professional community of therapists passionate about healing complex trauma. Learn more about this training and reserve your spot by visiting www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.